There we go. I pressed the right button. Good morning, everyone. 9:31, so we're going to jump right into this. Good morning. Thank you again for joining us this morning for our webinar, Managing the Mental Health of Your Employees. My name is Lori McIsaac. I'm the Director of Experiential Tourism with RTO9. I was, in preparing for this, I was reading a few articles over the weekend. I was reading one on burnout in the Harvard Business Review. It spoke to the challenges of the last couple of the years, the pandemic, of course, wildfires, political unrest, what's going on in Ukraine and other major stressors that have unfolded really in rapid succession that are compounding the damage to our collective mental health. Employers are responding with initiatives like offering additional mental health days, 4-day work weeks are a bit of a buzzword right now, and enhanced counseling. It's all pointing in the right direction. But offering a safe workplace means recognizing when your team is experiencing mental health issues and then having the tools to help them with that. So that's what today's session is about. Just a few housekeeping notes before I make the introductions. This webinar, as you heard, will be recorded and will be made available on our industry website within a few days. That's rto9.ca. If you have any questions, please enter them into the questions section and I will table them on your behalf. You can enter them at any point and then we'll address them ongoing through the presentation. So our co-facilitator, Hassel Aveles from Not 9 to 5 will be joining us shortly. I think she's just in transit. Not 9 to 5 is a nonprofit global leader in mental health advocacy for the food and beverage sector. Through practical education and meaningful community building, they are reimagining the hospitality industry by breaking stigmas and fueling hope. After decades as a hospitality professional and struggling with her own experiences with anxiety and depression, trauma and grief, Hassel was inspired rather to co-found Not 9 to 5, a nonprofit that empowers food service workers like herself. As executive director, she's made it a mission to provide mental health and substance use support by mobilizing educational resources and advocating for psychological safety. Hassel's strategic planning abilities help grow Not 9 to 5 from a series of workshops, panels, and webinars into a global vehicle for change. She aspires to start a worldwide hospitality revolution to create work environments that are inclusive and proactive rather than top-down and reactive. So she will be joining us shortly. In the meantime, I'd like to introduce Laura Louise Green. Give us a wave, Laura. Laura is a licensed professional counselor and organizational consultant from Chicago, Illinois. After working in the hospitality industry for nearly 20 years, Laura utilizes her knowledge and skills as a trained and licensed mental health professional to facilitate training, growth, and healing within the hospitality sector. She studied at DePaul University, earning a Master's of Education in Community Counseling, and is currently studying for her second Master's, way to go, Laura, this time in Organizational Psychology at Birkbeck University of London in the School of Business, Economics, and Informatics. Laura, good morning. I'm going to hand the floor over to you at this point and turn my microphone and camera off.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lori. And thank you everyone for being here. This is, I love talking about this, and it's, I think, one of the most important subjects. How do we actually address mental health issues in the workplace? So thank you for being here, and let's go ahead and get started. So first, to sort of clear up and be very intentional about what we're talking about, we can ask, what is mental health? And the World Health Organization's definition is my favorite. It's mental health is defined as a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. So notice in this definition, there is no mention, oh, hi, Hassel, she's here. Hi, good morning. But in this definition, there's no mention of hospitalization, of mental illness, or anything like that. And really, it's a very holistic look into someone's overall well-being. And mental health is very attached to our well-being. They definitely go hand in hand. But within these metrics of this definition, we're talking about stuff like, can you cope? Can you work productively? Can you deal and manage with everyday stressors? That's what mental health is. So what mental health is not is the absence of mental illness. It's not being happy all the time. We can't be happy all the time. There's just no way. It's not limited to when issues arise, or it's not limited to the most critical mental health issues. So our mental health is when we are in a really great state. It's when we're in a not great state. It's when we're fluxing in between. At every moment of every day, we are experiencing, we have mental health. So it's not limited to just a few experiences or moments or when things are the most dire. So what impacts our mental health? It's literally everything from moment to moment, every single day, from when you wake up, what your dreams are like, all of it. And that includes stuff like obviously work, but home life, community, politics, family, childhood, school, our bodies, what's happening in our bodies, how we're sleeping, what we consume, not just in terms of nutrition, but also, what are we watching on TV? What are we looking at on our phones, on our iPads or tablets? What are we actually consuming? What are we taking in? So all of those things impact our mental health. We can really simplify these things into 4 categories, though. You have social, interpersonal, biological, and experiential. Social being like the general narratives and rules of how we live. Like what are the narratives that as a society we believe, and then that informs our behavior and how we fit in. Interpersonal would be our like one-on-one and small group interactions. So interpersonal is definitely when we look at our groups in the workplace. We can also look at that as our families, the interactions we have with strangers on the street, with cashiers when we're checking out, with guests. Those are all interpersonal pieces that absolutely impact our mental health. And it's not just what happens within those interactions, it's how we perceive them and how we feel about them and how those interactions are building off of each other. And then of course there's biological, which I think is the most commonly thought of when we talk about what impacts our mental health. So that's not just like the neurochemical, like neurobiological chemical stuff happening in our brains. I'm also thinking about if we have pain in our body, if we have like, maybe there's a big hormonal change happening for us, maybe we're aging, maybe we have an injury, maybe we're not sleeping well. All of those things definitely impact our mental health. And then the last thing is experiential, which is just simply what happens to us. Stuff that maybe we can't control. And the interesting thing about these 4 things is that they're all overlapping constantly, and they're all feeding off of each other constantly. So if maybe we have a biological issue, maybe I'm experiencing some sort of pain because I broke my leg or whatever, and I can't get around as easy and I'm having a really hard time. But on top of it, I look around and socially there aren't a lot of access entryways into where I need to go. So that's going to be more frustrating, and these things compound on top of each other, on top of the trauma of actually breaking my leg. So all these sort of feed into each other. An analogy I like to use is to say like our mental health is like a house, and every house is different, right? Every house is built a little different, and every house is in different neighborhoods. So the neighborhood is going to impact the house, our neighbors, the weather in the area is going to impact our house. Those are the more like social pieces. The house itself, how is it built? How is it shaped? How's the foundation? Is there mold growing in the walls? Is the plumbing okay? That's when we're looking at our biological pieces. Interpersonal stuff, who do we allow in our house? Who comes in? Who barges in or maybe takes over and makes a mess? That's when we start to look at interpersonal pieces. And experiential, what happens to us, like what happens to our house, what does our house maintenance look like? And we can really push this analogy like as far as we want it to go. Like I even like to think about like sometimes if you like don't clean out your refrigerator enough and you have like leftovers and maybe they really need to go, because every time you open it, you're like, oh, that stinks, and you close it and you don't want to look at it. You're like, I don't want to address that right now. I'm just going to close it. That's another day thing. But then it starts to like smell up the whole house. Our mental health is the same way. When we don't address these things, it starts to permeate elsewhere. I also think like, I'm looking around my house in terms of like design, what are we carrying in from our parents? Like, what am I holding on to that belonged to my mom and dad, my grandma and grandpa, that maybe doesn't really fit in here and I don't need, and it's just causing clutter? What can I let go of? What do I mindfully bring into my home? And then what am I holding on to out of obligation? Do I need to do some regular maintenance? So Oh, my dog's dreaming. If you hear little yelps, he's dreaming. The other room. Sorry. So yeah, so it's a really great analogy model to think about all the things that impact our mental health and all the ways that we can address different mental health issues. Even let's say there's a hurricane and a tree comes through my window. I need to do work in my yard. I need to do work on the outside. I need to do work on the inside. I need to maybe get rid of some stuff and replace them. Like so there's not ever really one way to address mental health issues, which brings me to work and mental health. Work plays a really big role in our lives. So I'm going to hand it over to Hassel. Hi, Hassel, welcome.
Hello. Thank you so much. Laura, and everyone, I'm sorry I was a few minutes late logging in, but I'm here. And there, a lot of it has to do with work. Work absolutely intrudes and takes over very easily if we don't have boundaries, right? But I really want to highlight that work is such a huge part of our lives. As someone who, runs an organization and has a team that works under me, it does, and I love what I do. It really does take over so much of my life, and we see this in our hospitality and food service sector so often as well, because so many of us mix and interconnect work and our identity. So we tend to almost merge the two and mesh the two. There's almost like an enmeshment that can happen quite often in this industry. So I think it's just so important to highlight this, because work has a major influence on our well-being, on our bodies and our minds. And one of the biggest reasons, why this happens as well is because our brains are like sponges, right? They just absorb whatever is given, whatever it's exposed to. It feeds into our unconscious brains, and it's really hard for us to compartmentalize. Oftentimes we can't with certain things. And, we spend so much of our life at work, and this impact is so massive. Before I pass it back to you, Laura, one thing I did want to just bring up, I don't know if anyone here has watched the show Severance, but it is, okay, so it is so interesting. And when we were putting this presentation together and I was looking at this slide and thinking about it, this show kept coming back to me, because basically what happens in the show is they do a brain operation so that when you're at work, you cannot remember your home life. And when you're at home, you cannot remember your work life. So your brain is actually split, and you're almost like two different people in this show. It's a wild concept with very intense ramifications that hopefully this will never happen, because it's really, really disturbing. But anyways, it was just interesting to me how this show was trying to like take a very sci-fi weird approach to this topic of work-life balance.
Yeah, that's okay. So if I didn't have so much to do today, I would probably binge that right now, because that's like but it's an interesting premise, because we do think that we can compartmentalize these things, that we can, once we're at work, we're in work mode, and once we're at home, we're in home mode, or we could even look at it as work or outside of work. I mean, even just to say, I do struggle with the term work-life balance, because it implies that we need to fit life in with work, but it is, like, where does my life fit within my work, but we do that, especially in hospitality, Hassel, to your point, because there is so much merging and overlapping, and our relationships are also our colleagues, and our hobby is our work at the same time, and there's so much passion in it, it's hard. But I want to drive home to all of you, who are here and who are maybe in positions of power to change the workplace and really influence the workplace, that These things, though, are separate, and even though they influence each other, so like if, let's say we're having interpersonal issues at home, that's going to create possibly interpersonal patterns at work as well. Like the way that we take in information from each other and from our experiences, that doesn't change either way. So if we're experiencing problems at work, we're probably to a degree experiencing some sort of problem or turmoil or issue in how we relate to people outside of our work. But in a boundary sense, it's important to know that like none of us can or should try to fix anyone's home life situation. But what we can acknowledge is that it does influence the workplace, and the workplace that we create can influence someone's home life as well. So the way I like to look at it is that, you know, for those of us who control the workplace in a really big way, our job is to create a space that doesn't do further harm at base, doesn't do further harm to what's happening in someone's life, so that they at least have a fighting chance to like fix what's happening outside of work. You know, so it's not anyone's responsibility to heal someone's outside life, but it is our responsibility to, you know, not do further harm. And unfortunately, especially in hospitality, the workplace has a tendency to do that because people are so invested and so passionate. So we're focusing on work here today. And just reviewing stress really quick. I think this was me, I'm gonna do it. So stress can be defined as any type of change that causes physical, emotion, or psychological strain. Stress is your body's response to anything that requires attention or action. So if you joined us last month, we talked about managing our stress as people who are in positions of power and leadership. Stress is our friend. It's there to let us know that we have more to learn and we have something we have opportunities for growth. Stress becomes unmanageable when we don't cope adaptively with it, which we'll talk about again in just a moment. But you have your physiological responses, which is like sweating, increased heart rate, increased adrenaline. You just get like kind of hyped up and hypervigilant, and cognitively you start your focus around blurs out and you get like a pinhole focus. It's really hard to try and do two things at the same time. It's hard to do that anyway. But there's also, when we talk about stress, there's the moment-to-moment stress, and then there's interpersonal and socio-emotional stress that comes from you know, how the environment is. So one kind of stress, an example would be if the printer is printing like wild in the service well, that's stressful because there's a lot to do and someone has to do a lot of work really quickly. But the interpersonal, that socio-emotional stress, is more about, am I valued? Am I cared for? And all of that. So I'm going to hand it over to Hassel to talk a little bit about stress and performance.
Yes, thank you. I think that one thing I wanted to highlight today is specific to what you just shared, Laura, about focus and attention and all the things that happen when there's so much happening, right? So it's really important to understand, you know, as a leader, as an employer, as a manager, if you have influence in your space, it's really important for, you know, us to understand that there's certain ways in which our brains work, and that it's not a personality thing. It's actually the way we're wired, and we can't handle multiple tasks while stressed for prolonged periods. We need to have, you know, as leaders, we need to be thoughtful and realistic about what folks are capable of. And on that topic, I just want to bust a myth on multitasking, because so often we talk about, you know, I'm such a good multitasker, or, you know, our team's so great at multitasking, and sometimes our industry really demands that we multitask. But I really want to highlight that multitasking is a myth, and that when we, you know, what is actually happening in our minds is not multitasking, because that's not a thing, but what happens is that we're actually doing something called task switching. So the focus of our minds, almost think of it like, I heard this analogy recently, to think of it like a flashlight. So your flashlight is focusing on one task, for example, but we don't have multiple flashlights. We have one flashlight. And so when you're saying something like multitasking, it's not like you all of a sudden have 4 flashlights. That's not what's happening. What's happening is that you're engaging or disengaging in a task. So we move from one task to the next task and then move again. And these task switches over and over and over are taxing and extremely exhausting and impact us in a very severe way. And so obviously when we're talking about stress and performance, this impacts our performance, and it even more intensifies it if we're in a stressful environment, which obviously in our industry we are. So I just want to highlight that because as leaders, like I said, we need to be thoughtfully realistic about what our teams are capable of. And also, I wanted to highlight that stress, when your needs are met, is actually a positive thing. Because I think so often we just put stress in a bad bucket, you know, or like a negative. We have like a negative concept of it, but it's not necessarily true. We need to start to think of it more in a neutral way, and that it depends what kind of stress, like Laura was emphasizing, there's different kinds, but also how much of it is happening and whether your needs are being met in the moment. So yeah, that's what I wanted to share on stress and performance.
Oh, I hit it twice.
Next slide. Oh,
Cool.
there we go. So how does that affect the way that we cope? I think so oftentimes we're not as specific as to the types of coping mechanisms we're using. So this slide is really great at explaining the difference between adaptive and maladaptive coping. So the definitions are there for you to read. And, you know, an adaptive coping method, for example, I'll give you a positive example, or sorry, a relatable example. Adaptive coping could be a way in the ways in which you are addressing the stress yourself as a leader, because you have so much influence and because, you know, you set the tone for the workplace. If you are, you know, really focusing on your self-care, and that can mean physically, you know, getting enough physical exercise, getting enough sleep, that kind of thing, or taking enough breaks. You know, one of the best ways that I like to cope is taking breaks, and really normalizing taking breaks. I grew up in an industry where no one took breaks, and they were not only were they not being taken, they were not encouraged. And the only people that ended up taking breaks were those that were going for a smoke. And so many times people start smoking just to take a break. But anyways, an example, I find the most common maladaptive coping example that unfortunately can cause harm if not managed is substance use. And that is so common, obviously, in hospitality and food service. So many of us have been, you know, normalized to high amounts of substance use. And so one thing I just want to highlight is that we are more aware of the differences, right, between the adaptive coping and the maladaptive coping. And as leaders, you know, trying to create a safe workplace, this means making sure that we are paying attention and addressing substance use in the workplace, and not shaming or ignoring substance use, you know, for our team and our employees. If folks are, you know, struggling with that we are practicing harm reduction, you know, and treating everyone with dignity and respect, regardless of their relationship with substances.
Awesome. Thank you, Hassel. Oh, nervous system regulation. This is one of my favorites. Do you want to keep going on this?
Sure, I'll keep going. So yes, nervous system regulation. So as we were saying, you know, stress, it affects your performance. There's different ways to cope with that. And one of the most impactful ways is learning how to regulate our nervous systems. There's obviously so many different ways in which you can do this, and everyone, it's really good to pay attention to what works best for you, but also to offer your team, different ways, or for you to understand also that there's ways that you can normalize nervous system regulation in the workplace. Like I was saying earlier with the focus and the flashlight. So one way you can exercise a lot of these things is with breath work or mindfulness practices, because what happens is that your flashlight, for example, begins to learn how to, pick a target for attention versus that task switching we were talking about earlier. We want to try to reduce that wherever possible. Obviously understanding that there's cases in where that's not possible, but learning how to build a practice of keeping that flashlight on one spot. So focusing, noticing, and redirecting can happen when you're doing things like breath work. So, box breathing is one way to do it, or just taking a moment to connect with your body. Some people I know in the kitchen, they like to do this in the walk-in. They go take a moment in the walk-in and just kind of get away from the chaos of service maybe for a moment. And if you can do that in small, segments over time, it can really, you can really learn how to regulate your nervous system. And that can be a form of stress management. Another way is, like I was saying earlier, mindfulness, paying attention to the present moment, that experience is really important. And it's not just about meditation or stuff like that. Meditation is another way to do it for sure, but not everyone, likes to meditate or knows how to. So even just learning how to start by bringing mindfulness more into your experience. And when I say mindfulness, what I mean is that you're in the here and now. So for me in this moment, I'm right now here speaking in this presentation on my laptop, and I'm not creating a story about it. And I'm also not reacting to it. So learning how to manage that and learning how to do that is a way you can practice mindfulness anywhere. And these are different amazing ways that you can practice and learn how to do that are free and you can take with you anywhere.
That's awesome. Yeah, that nervous system regulation is so important, because if we're elevated all the time, that means our emotional life is going to also dysregulate. And, emotions are contagious. So it's up to leadership to help team members de-escalate when they're having trouble to regulate. I think we can all identify times in our lives when, or even in our day, when we find ourselves around someone that's super hyper elevated, and you can just kind of feel that energy coming off of them, and then you start to feel super stressy, and that energy is really contagious. And our emotional lives, we start to it's what empathy is. It's how we're feeling each other's feelings, and it's an unavoidable thing, to be honest, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, we will be picking up on other people's stuff. Now, that means that as someone who has control in a space, you are able to regulate your own stuff, your own nervous system, and your own emotional life to set a very strong baseline for for people to meet you, where to meet you. An example I like to give of this, and I told this to Hassel, I used to see this client. He was about 10 or 11 years old, I think. I don't know. Honestly, it's all a blur at this point. But I was in my clinical internship, and he always had so much energy coming in. He was coming from after school. We had a great relationship. We always played games. He was excited. It was a fun time to be together. And my supervisor said, do you see how he's all the way up here and you're matching his energy, as we would listen back to the tapes? And I was like, yeah. And she was like, you need to have your energy here and then he'll come to meet you. And that's when you can really start doing the work. Because if he's elevated all the time, we're not really able to, when we're so elevated, we're not really able to access the nuance of our emotional lives or identifying what our needs are. So then we get more and more elevated and it becomes into like this big, big cycle. But as managers, something that you can do is prioritize that own personal regulation, both in your nervous system and in understanding your own emotional lives. And people will meet you there. People will come down and meet you there. So then if you have like day-to-day interactions with people, it's not so rough. It is so easy to escalate a situation when people's energy gets higher and higher. And I want to emphasize something that Hassel said earlier about our emotional lives, that when our needs are being met, the pleasantness of our experience is greater. So our emotions then are going to be more positive at a higher energy level. So for example, let's say my needs are being met. I'm high energy. I'm like really excited. I might be a little stressed, but it's because I'm doing something new and it's cool and my needs are being met. That's excited. That's being elated. That is, an amazing feeling. If my needs aren't being met and my energy is up because I'm experiencing stress, I'm doing something for the first time, but I don't have what I need, that turns into like anger, rage, frustration. So if we look at stress in these ways of like creating a stressful environment or living in an inevitably stressful environment, like in the hospitality industry, like in restaurants, like in guest facing positions or back of house even, but people's needs are being met, social needs, emotional needs, all of that stuff, that becomes an exciting workspace and an innovative workspace and a very cool space to be. And I think that's what draws us to the industry a lot. But when our needs aren't being met, that's when it starts to become more abusive. So that brings me to, oops,
I think we missed a slide.
I know, I'm like, my finger is too much coffee.
So I think the next slide
which one?
Is what you were just talking about with emotions being contagious, right?
Yeah, so we were here on emotions are contagious, and then what causes socio-emotional workplace stress. So when we talk,
sorry to interrupt you, Laura, it's not switching for me. It still says nervous system regulation.
Oh, that's weird. Did it do it now?
Now it's switched. Okay.
Oh my God, it seems like there's a little bit. I have two windows open. One is in presenter mode and the other one is, so it seems like.
Sorry about that, folks.
No, that's okay. Thank you for letting me know. So what causes socio-emotional workplace stress? So again, I mentioned that there's like different kinds of stress. The one is like that experiential stress, the printer going too much. And then there's also like socio-emotional stress. And this is the stuff that I think we focus too much on, the stress of the moment to moment stress stuff. We're like, I'm just so stressed, I'm so stressed. But it's the socio-emotional workplace stress that is really the stuff that starts to sort of erode at us. This is the stress that causes burnout. There's also, we could reference toxic stress, which is stress that comes from foundational childhood experiences that could make its way into the workplace. But all of those foundational experiences dictate how we behave in groups. So what this looks like is lack of control, like no autonomy over your role, over what happens to you, over how you can express yourself or be. We see this lack of control a lot in, when people don't have a say of what their goals are, what their job is, how they can really express their strengths and what they're interested in, or react to a guest and respond to a guest. If you can't have control in that way, that becomes a definite a socio-emotional stress. Lack of clarity on roles, or lack of clarity on, and this is an extension, I would say, of control over what's happening, like not knowing, like, oh my gosh, are we going to stay open? Are we going to close? That communication isn't there. So that becomes a form of lack of control, but lack of clarity is its own thing in its own right. especially in times of crisis and high needs, when people don't know if their needs are going to be met. Unbalanced workload can cause a lot of toxic stress in the workplace, that is just unreasonable to achieve what you need to achieve in the time that you have and with what you're being paid. And when I say unbalanced workload, it's more that the demands of what we have to do far outweigh the resources we have to do them. And those resources might be things like time, skills, but it also is stuff like, emotional regulation skills and social support. And then the last one is workplace toxicity, which we'll go into further in depth. So I'm going to hand that over to Hassel.
Okay. Toxic workspaces. Whew. It brings back so many memories, unfortunately. I grew up in hospitality and restaurants, food service, and unfortunately, there are a lot of toxic workspaces in this industry. There's a lot that doesn't get addressed in the workplace. So, in those socio-emotional workplace stress factors that Laura was just talking about really contribute to burnout. And so learning how to address these can help prevent it. And, now we have a better understanding of burnout as a society. We're starting to see it more as an occupational phenomenon and understanding the connection between burnout and leadership accountability and systemic change. Versus where before in the past, it was thought of more as a personal moral failure, right? Like as an individual failing. So I just want to highlight that part of preventing burnout and in creating workplaces that aren't toxic is really, really important because it can help to contribute to us avoiding or preventing, more prevention work around these, keeping, things less toxic and decreasing the rates of burnout. So everyone agrees, that toxic culture is bad, obviously, but there's very little overlap in terms of what actually constitutes a toxic culture. What's the definition of toxic workspaces, and how do we get on the same page about it? There's a lot of things that we may find annoying in the workplace, but that doesn't mean that it's downright toxic. So one interesting thing that is starting to happen in the world are people researching and studying toxic workspaces. And two people that Laura and I really love to learn from or read or follow are Donald and Charlie Sull. They recently released an article about how toxic culture is driving the Great Resignation. And they're doing some amazing work to start to define toxic workspaces. So, it's important for us to understand this. Hospitality and food service was included in this research, by the way. So it does affect us as well. Our sector is included in this. And, unfortunately, so much of this, of these factors that make up toxic workspaces has been normalized in the hospitality industry. But I wanted to highlight this as well, that oftentimes we think that compensation might be the only thing that makes people leave our industry, and it's actually not entirely true. It turns out toxic cultures are 10 times more powerful than compensation in predicting a company's attrition rate compared, within the industry. And so I just want to really highlight that, because if you're an employer, leader, manager, anyone in leadership, that this is really, really important for the sustainability of your business, keeping you profitable, keeping you sustainable, and making sure, that we understand this will really help us in addressing it. So I think the next slide, we're going through the main factors of toxic workspaces. It's not switching for me. No, there's one before that. There we go. Oh, I can't hear you.
Sorry, this wasn't up the whole time. I'm so sorry. I don't know why there's a lag between these two.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, so I just wanted to quickly run through, these were the factors that they put into their research on how they defined what is a toxic workspace. Disrespect, cutthroat, abusive, unethical, and non-inclusive. Laura, we were gonna run through the specifics later though, right? I won't jump into each one. Yeah, okay. So those are the 5 factors. That's now how we're moving forward in defining toxic workspaces, and we'll dive into them deeper in a minute.
Yeah, so sorry, I didn't realize that it wasn't changing with when I clicked it.
It's okay.
So yeah, so those toxic factors, it was really interesting how they found those toxic factors. So they used Glassdoor and they reviewed in all sorts of industries how people you know, really reported on their experiences with an organization. And I think they also were using exit interviews and stuff like that. And then they thematically analyzed that from a qualitative standpoint. And then now they're working on, since those like 5 factors exist, we can create actual measurement tools through survey data of how to measure toxic workspaces, which is really, really interesting and neat work that I'm sure we're going to see a lot of development in the next few years. So it's not the individual. When we look at so when we look at like reducing workplace stress in terms of these like toxic factors, it's really up to leaders to identify like what has to happen in order to make those things change, and up to leaders to create systems to address these issues. It's not about the individual at the end of the day. It's about how the group is operating in and of itself. So one person can make an impact on the rest of the group, but there has to be a group buy-in, and those individuals like business owners, managers, even our indirect leaders are the ones that are really going to make the big differences in these spaces, which means that we need to create systems of feedback. And Hassel, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
All right, thank you. So creating systems of feedback. So, I mean, I want to acknowledge too that a lot of this is not, requires a lot of unlearning, especially if you grew up in hospitality, food service, kitchens, restaurants, bars. A lot of these environments were not open to a system of feedback. So a lot of us are doing a lot of, like I said, unlearning and relearning around this and practice, right? So it's going to take a lot of practice. Feedback is something that a lot of us can be sensitive to, and that's natural. You're human. But it's really important to practice and learn how to give and receive feedback, how to normalize the culture of feedback, you know, normalize a culture of addressing control. And what this really starts for me to kind of lead into is the term, the concept of psychological safety. And, you know, part of psychological safety is giving and receiving feedback, and that practice of being able to make mistakes and be vulnerable with one another, you know, and not have any fear of negative consequences to how you're perceived or your job itself. It's important to acknowledge that it's natural to stumble along the way as you're creating these systems of feedback, because it's not easy, right? And it needs to be also, it needs to be said that this feedback is for us as leaders and owner operators as well. So often we think of our team, you know, that, oh, we need to get their feedback, we need to involve them. And absolutely, yes, we do. The more that you can involve them, the more you can foster that psychologically safe workplace. But also for ourselves, you know, we need to be able to be accountable and open to receive feedback on our leadership, and on the way that we're running the workplace. So how to start? Part of that really is in building a culture of check-ins. I think check-ins can look differently in different workplaces, depending on how service goes, depending on your team, the size of your team, and all of that. Part of building a culture of check-ins, I think, is intentionally checking in with everyone and on a regular basis. So oftentimes check-ins might only happen like as a one-off, and that's not really a culture of check-in. That's just like a one-off check-in. So really highlighting that there's a difference there. If you're building a culture of check-ins, it normalizes this as something that happens often and regularly. And like anything, the more you do it, the easier it gets. But this was important pre-pandemic, but really these days is crucial because there's so much changing so quickly in terms of restrictions and in terms of also what is happening in the world, and it impacts everyone. And so waiting for folks to really answer questions and really listening and encouraging questions and concerns and normalizing that's part of creating that culture of checking in. And the last thing I wanted to say on this topic as well is that you yourself as the leader be vulnerable. So you're practicing active listening, right? You're listening to understand, not just to respond, but you have to also be, as a leader, vulnerable as well. And what that means is, you're promoting a lot of this yourself, you're practicing a lot of this yourself, and you're reassuring your team that it is safe to do so without being judged or penalized along the way.
Thank you, Hassel. So a part of that is built into career development, and career development is something that we really overlook in our industry. And I can say that both from my time as a manager and throughout the opportunities that were offered to me in my career. What I see a lot of in terms of career development is, so I'll just talk, I guess, about boundaryless careers a little bit. So boundaryless careers, there's really two types of career pathways and mindsets. The first one is a boundaryless career, in which you go from place to place to learn and grow. You are seeking opportunities to make you better as a person and as a professional. You are not limiting to yourself to a single career or field or space. It's boundaryless. You kind of go where you feel you're going to be benefited as a human being the most. So you might, for example, be a teacher, and then you work in the hospitality industry, and then you find yourself in the drinks industry, and then you just move with the current of your life. A traditional career is that more structured, more pyramid type career, that you start as an entry level and you join a company, and then you work your way up and you get promoted and your pay increases and your title changes to the point that you are at the top, and then you retire. You stay in one field the entire time. You never really make a big change. Yeah, so that's a more traditional thing. And throughout our careers, we have different elements of that. Like sometimes we want more stability, so we go one more traditional route. Sometimes we really just want to explore stuff. We can start our careers very traditionally and then move into a more boundaryless space when we have the ability to move around and be a little bit more agile within our careers. Sometimes there's a combination, and we see traditional careers in restaurants and in the hospitality industry from individuals who maybe start as a dishwasher and then they become a prep cook, and then they work their way up and suddenly they're the executive chef of a hotel or whatever. So it does exist within the hospitality industry, but in terms of what career development looks like from a boundaryless standpoint, because I would say most of the industry has a boundaryless approach to their career. People moving from place to place every 6 months, or following the openings, or they learn through the chef that they're working with, or they want to learn a new cuisine. So there is a more boundaryless space, but with boundaryless careers, there's an expectation that any sort of career training or development happens outside of the workplace. And that's a problem. Like, that creates a big problem for our industry because we don't have the same sort of retention, because in order to learn, people are moving to different spaces. To learn a new cuisine, they're quitting their job and moving to wherever, a new restaurant, a new city, and so forth. You know, with the great quit that we're seeing right now, the great resignation, one of the other main things that we're seeing is that people are leaving to learn more. So they want that career development that they don't feel like they're getting. And there is some overlap with that toxic workplace element, but we're seeing people running to career development and running from toxicity, if that makes sense. So when we talk about systems of feedback within career development, this looks like mentorship and, you know, career coaching within the workplace. There's, you know, I think a very pervasive idea is that, well, if people are just going to leave in 6 months, then why am I investing any kind of training in them? And that creates this really gnarly cycle of like, the employee then saying, and the team member saying, why do I feel like I should stay here if they just are not going to give me anything? You know, so as leaders, it's important for us to be the ones to break that cycle and say, we know that you're probably going to leave when you graduate with your degree, but we want to make sure that you have what you need to work here now. And, you know, you just never know that what people are going to do with their careers if they are met with some sort of development in the workplace. It can be like, okay, so you are, you know, you're finishing your undergraduate degree. We know that you want to be a lawyer. You just got accepted to law school. We're so excited for you. What can we do to foster skills here that you're going to need in the rest of your career? So that could look like, you know, crisis management, you know, which we need plenty of in this industry, public speaking skills. You know, maybe you help that person to, you know, present the new wines to the team during pre-shift. You know, those are forms of career development that maybe you wouldn't know if you don't talk to people to be like, this is what I want out of my career. And people might find a home in the industry that they didn't expect. Like, I did not expect to still be doing this, to be honest. Like, I thought I was going to go be a therapist. So, you know, but seeing what potential there is for this industry, someone going into marketing, there's a lot of potential in this industry for marketing. So just keeping in mind that career development is really important when we're looking at people's mental health. We don't want people to look at their time in this industry as their lost years. We want people to say, this was a time where I really found myself. This was a time that, you know, I was able to express myself and try new things and learn new skills that I still carry with me, and something that people can be proud of being part of this industry, instead of looking back and saying like, well, that was terrible, which unfortunately is all too common. But piggybacking more on that, that feedback bit, from this, you can also create jobs for people, like new roles. You know, the industry as a structure, how the hierarchy works and everything like that. If we want to make changes in the industry, we have to really decide what stays and what doesn't. And doing things like accepting feedback from people, listening to their needs, helping empowering them to express their needs. That's what helps us to create new roles, like a lot of roles that are popping up of like director of impact or director of culture. A lot of really cool, innovative roles that wouldn't have happened if there hadn't been a system of feedback within the restaurant or the hotel or the workplace in general. So it's important, like career development is really, really important. Also from a leadership standpoint, to be able to mentor people and guide them, it really just makes our jobs way more fulfilling to know that we are like facilitating growth within the workplace. And from a mental health standpoint, it's tremendous. So, you know, career development can also look like, this is the last thing I'll say about it. I love talking about career development, obviously. It's so cool. Cross training is a really great form of career development. Like someone from the front of house presenting wine to the back of house, like you could like, there's so much potential, like, you know, doing front of house stages in the back of house. of like, how do I, how do I improve my knife skills? Like as a bartender, I spent much of my career as a bartender, and I would have loved to learn knife skills from somebody instead of cutting my lemons like hot garbage for a minute, so having that exchange, having that knowledge exchange is very, very important. Okay, so toxic workplaces explained. Handing it over to
Next
Hazel.
slide. Yes. Laura, thank you. Oh, we missed the slide.
Is it not?
There we go.
Oh,
There we go. Okay. Thank you for that, Laura, because I think career development is like, we could have a whole segment on that. And it's something in our industry that can really work against creating these toxic workspaces that we're going to address now. So moving into how to support your team and moving into toxic, oh, sorry, go back still. I'm going to explain toxic workspaces on those 5 points. So the first one was non-inclusive. And, what we mean by that is, looking at topics of LGBTQ plus inequity or the disability community or racial inequity, gender inequity. It's the discussion of diversity overall, and including in the discussion of inclusion on all fronts and wherever folks intersect. Was one of the first largest points of defining a toxic workspace. So if you have a non-inclusive environment, then that is going to contribute to your workspace being toxic. The second one is around disrespect, and people talk about feeling disrespected in the workforce. If your team is feeling that way, that will contribute to the toxicity of the workplace. The next one is unethical behavior. I think that can include dishonesty, and lack of integrity. There's low integrity with certain behavior, dishonesty. There's a lot of ways in which this can show up, and unethical behavior contributes to that toxic workspace. The fourth is cutthroat. So that's specifically when people are going out of their way to undermine one another. And then the last one is abusive. Leaders, managers that are being physically, emotionally, or verbally abusive. We're seeing this in the workplace. Obviously, that makes for a toxic workspace. So we're going to go through these 5 and how to address them. So what the kind of antidote is to each. So the first one, okay, now we can switch, is non-inclusive. And so I did cover a little bit of like how we're defining that, but I want to dive further into how to go against that so that you're not creating a toxic workplace. And that is by creating a culture of belonging. So making sure that you're constantly curious about who is in the room or who is not in the room, and who is speaking up and who is not speaking up, who is getting promoted, who is not getting promoted. Really looking at that through a data lens, measuring these factors for ourselves and inquiring, getting really curious, without judgment. It's not always going to help you if you're just judging yourself and feeling bad. You really want to look at this as from a neutral perspective and just from a data perspective. There's ways you can answer those questions in a quantitative way. And that will help you start to build that culture of belonging. As well, in addition to that, I would say is making sure that you are acknowledging, but also addressing the differences for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, for LGBTQ plus communities, for the disabled community, making sure that you are connecting to folks that have these lived experiences and involving them in determining how to modify policies and practices. If you're not of that community, there needs to be an engagement there with folks that have that lived experience, and making sure that you're prioritizing and not prioritizing these conversations, prioritizing this culture of belonging, but also not making assumptions. And so really making sure that you're taking that like customized approach to addressing that culture of belonging. Next slide.
Okay.
I think that's you, Laura.
Yep. Abusive to nurturing. So in abusive workspaces, we're looking at like different power dynamics and how we are utilizing our power. So abusive workspaces, unfortunately, they get results, and we see that result, and we see that result happen quickly. So for example, if we look at different power dynamics, there's power over, which is when we gain power by imparting fear into people, where we literally like hang over them. And that's, I think, the most common way that we see power in restaurants, unfortunately. Like, we look at Gordon Ramsay screaming at people and demeaning them, and like, if you make a mistake, you're going to get screamed at, you're going to get kicked out of the kitchen, so people do things in order to not get screamed at and not get kicked out of the kitchen, as opposed to this power within dynamic, which is when we are proud of the work that we do and we are empowered to do something. Power two is when leadership empowers people to make decisions and be more autonomous. But yeah, that power over is what we're looking at when we see these really abusive workspaces. And like I said, the problem with this abusive workspace is that it does get results, and there is this feeling that comes from people that they're like, well, I was talking actually to someone last night about exactly this, and he said, yeah, that guy was a jerk, and yeah, he made me like wash his car and stuff like that, but he taught me how to be a little bit more put together, and he taught me discipline, and he taught me this. And the argument in the room was, you can learn those things without being abused by someone. You can learn discipline, you can learn structure, you can learn how to have integrity with the work that you're doing without being screamed at by someone all the time. So yes, abusive workspaces get the desired result, but with all of this other stuff of like mental health issues and substance use issues to cope. So what we want to move more towards is a nurturing workspace, and that doesn't mean, oh, my little cat friend, sorry, there's a cat outside that I've been trying to catch, and there she goes. I've been worried about her. But, we want to move more towards nurturing workspaces where people can come into themselves and come into their own power. It's that whole like power, you gain power by giving power away. And that also bleeds into exactly what Hassel was talking about creating systems of belonging. But creating spaces where people can make mistakes. It's not like you want people running around like just making mistakes all the time and there's no repercussions of that, but understanding that they're not going to get screamed at. There are being clear, and this comes to the clarity bit, being clear of the reason why we do it this way is this, 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 and this, as opposed to the reason that you should do it this way is because you're avoiding getting screamed at. So we can achieve, like I said, we can achieve those, those growth elements without actively abusing people. So yeah, I'll hand it back over to Hassel for unethical spaces.
Okay. So I think, as we're going through these 5 and moving into Q&A after, when we're done our presentation, we'd love to hear also how you're addressing some of these things, in your workplace, and have a discussion on that. I think this looks different for every workplace. For unethical, obviously, we know dishonesty and certain things that are considered, harmful. There's another one though that I find often doesn't get talked about, which is failure to comply with regulation. In our industry, I find that there's not enough integrity-driven leadership around certain workplace policies when it comes to health and safety, and especially when we're talking about workplace mental health and supporting your team. There's a lot of information that isn't shared with employees and teams around their rights, and what they are, what they have a right to, what they deserve. And some of that, can, for example, can specifically look like workplace accommodations, not being, not being in an environment where they can be requested, and then B, not being in an environment where the employer is following their duty to accommodate. I think that's one example of, unethical versus integrity driven. It's really important that we are, as leaders and managers or owners of a space, that we are leading by always complying with regulation that we have, and obviously having that honesty versus dishonesty. If we know better, we need to do better. And I think that, right, it's like a cheesy saying, but I think it's really true. And when another way that that shows up in our industry, the hospitality community sometimes has this culture of authenticity, and being like really raw and open. And there's just certain parts of ourselves that, can't come to work. It's just not ethical, to put folks in a situation as your team, especially like when you talk about power dynamics, like Laura was talking about. You can't cross that line with abuse of power and, and almost holding people hostage in certain situations. That is obviously the opposite of integrity driven. And also a lot of these factors, like I said earlier, can contribute to burnout. So making sure that you're creating that culture that is preventing burnout, that there is those factors that that we can use to prevent burnout, like Laura highlighted earlier, like lack of role clarity, the role clarity being a huge one. And yeah, I think that is what I wanted to say on moving from unethical into integrity driven. The next slide is you, Laura.
Yeah. So cutthroat to supportive and growth oriented. People competing for menu placements or for promotions isn't functional. Like we can look also at cutthroat cultures as like a hazing culture in the back of house that you need to really cut your teeth. You need to like experience some serious dehumanization in order to be accepted into our crew. Those are examples of being cutthroat. Undermining each other and like trying to steal recipes from each other, and it's just, that's nasty. Or like in servers in the front of house, like trying to get to different shifts and sections, and all of those things are the result of not having enough resources and creating systems of scarcity of like there can only, it's like this isn't the Highlander, like we don't have to cut off each other's heads so that there can only be one, you know what I mean? But we act like it is like only one person can get this, only one person can get this. And scarcity stuff comes from trauma, backgrounds of trauma, not having the resources, and so people try to hold on to what they can. But it is possible for us to create supportive and growth oriented environments where people can help each other, and maybe instead of stealing each other's cocktails, they're collaborating on cocktails. Maybe we can say like, okay, so and so is really strong here and they need more growth here. Maybe we can have them work more with this person and they can like, do you see what I'm saying? So creating systems where people are able to grow, are able to make mistakes and try new things and take risks, and fail fast within the organization so that it can be more supportive. And when they fail fast, you can have a little post-mortem of like, what happened there? That wasn't it. What went right? What didn't go right? That's how we create supportive and growth-oriented environments. But it's important to intervene if you start seeing this sort of like cutthroat piece and take a look around and say like, all right, why do all of these people think that there's not enough resources to go around? Is it because there aren't enough resources? And then how do we provide more resources? How do we provide more career education and development? You know, that's a really great, it's a really great way to really foster that. I'm going to add also ostracism into this a little bit. You know, as I talk about this, I realize that ostracism is a very common way that we create. Ostracism is a function of a group trying to come together in a tight way. And what they do is choose a common enemy to do that. So you create a sense of group cohesion by having one person not be a part of the group and everyone is in this shared feeling against that person. But ostracism is so disruptive, not just for our mental health, but it's one of like psychologically, it's one of the most traumatic things, like to be socially excluded, to be ostracized. It's not a good look. The problem, and we use it a lot in restaurants, like, and it's a natural evolutionary thing that happens that we don't need anymore. Like we don't need to ostracize people like that anymore. So if you see that starting to happen, like there's one person being targeted, that means that the group is trying to find cohesion, but doesn't have the tools to find cohesion. So imagining other ways of like, how can we help people to connect more in the workplace and have more systems of social support without ostracizing somebody? Because once that one person quits, there's going to be another person. It's like sharks in the water, you know, there's going to be one more person. So those systems happen over and over again in hospitality, but finding ways to create those resources so that the group can come together and rely on each other and create that interdependence will be really helpful in getting rid of that toxicity.
Oof, you're reminding me, sorry, Laura, I was going to say, you're reminding me of cancel culture as well.
Yes.
Right? Such an example of that that's relatable. And you see that, yeah, you see that a lot, I feel like these days.
Yeah, and with the cancel culture stuff, like, you know, canceling somebody, you know, it's one thing to say like, you are a dangerous person, we don't want you here, but canceling as a form of ignoring our own complicity within stuff is what I honestly see the most in like, especially like social media cancel culture. Like I don't want to look in my refrigerator and see my stinky leftover food. I'm going to point out yours, but mine is there. It's not going to, but if I point out yours, no one's going to see mine. But yeah, so into just disrespectful versus appreciative, like your team is your greatest asset. And we often see, you know, the labor column of our P&L as our biggest liability and our biggest cost. But it is absolutely our greatest asset. You cannot have hospitality without people. Like you can have a menu, but you need the people. And, you know, the people and how people are feeling emotionally and how they're treated from a socio-emotional standpoint will also dictate the hospitality they provide, because there's a very clear difference between hospitality and service. Like we can teach service skills, but hospitality is an emotional process. So people feeling respected, feeling like they matter, knowing they matter, and knowing that they're valued is tremendous. And, you know, moving from a disrespectful space of like, well, you're just going to leave in 6 months anyway, so I'm not even going to bother with this, into an appreciative space of, you know, like Hassel said, creating a culture of check-ins. And that check-in can even be like, hey, you're doing a really great job lately, and I just wanted to check in with you and like let you know that it means the world to us that you're showing up the way that you are. Acknowledging growth, acknowledging when people are really making an effort, and appreciating them. And even when people are maybe struggling a little bit, just saying like, we're just really happy you're here. We know you're struggling. We want to be able to help you, but we're really happy that you're here. You know, and creating appreciative environments might involve a pizza party, but it is more, I mean, I'm never going to tell anybody to not have a pizza party for people, but it's so much more than, you know, than saying like, and it's even more than just saying like, I appreciate you. It's actually appreciating people. And as leaders, if we can practice that appreciation, and, you know, not to sound like a Pinterest article or post or Instagram, but like practicing that gratitude towards people, it'll make us feel better about our work too. And it also help relieve our stress, and we can find more assets, you know, emerging in that way within our team. So moving on to the next slide to Sel.
All right. So accountability and responsibility. This is our second last slide. We've come to the end. We have one more after this, and then we're moving into Q&A. But this is a really important point, I think, to end on as we're coming near the end, to really highlight is, you know, we cannot undervalue, underestimate, emphasize here the importance that you play as a leader, the influence you have, you know, the tone that you set, all of that comes from, you know, it always has a trickle down effect. So whatever's happening, you know, in the top is going to find its way down, and we need to, as leaders, hold ourselves accountable and responsible for that impact, right? For that influence. And that also can go a variety of different ways in terms of role modeling as well. So I think when it comes to leadership accountability, I just want to say that it's really important as well to emphasize that it goes even beyond us as well. So like the systemic change part that is required as this industry evolves. I mean, hospitality as an industry has neglected workplace mental health as a topic for centuries. And even as we're coming into a time now where we are addressing it, we have to acknowledge that that we're new to this. We have to acknowledge that we're going to make mistakes along the way, and that, you know, that encourages that feedback loop we were talking about earlier, and that we can't avoid the vulnerability of that, you know, that we can't expect others to do what we're not doing as leaders ourselves, and we need to hold ourselves responsible in making sure that we're role modeling to our team, to our employees, that, you know, that we're doing the things to take care of our own selves, that we're setting the boundaries that are required in the workplace, and that we're also focusing on everyone's well-being as a priority. As Laura said, people are our biggest asset. There is no business model or business if no one shows up to work. Doesn't matter how nice your space is, or how high quality premium ingredients you use, or how much money you spent, you know, on certain equipment. If folks don't show up, nothing works. And the emotional labor also that Laura was highlighting in terms of hospitality, it often goes unnoticed and unrecognized, you know, and so we really need to be aware of that. And so there needs to be like verbal acknowledgement of all of these things, written acknowledgement into your policies and procedures around all of this as well. And then the last point is the measurement of it all. So making sure that, you know, we are measuring everything that we're doing, that helps to ensure accountability. And, you know, that can be handled as a survey, for example, or that can be handled in different ways in which you measure the impact of maybe some training that you've invested in. There's so many different ways in which you can do that, but understanding where people, what they're doing now, or sorry, what's been done in the past, what people are doing now, and what we're working towards in the future is another way. Measuring all of that is another way in which we can ensure that we're holding ourselves accountable and being responsible as leaders.
Thank you.
And now back to Laura.
So with this, you have to take risks and try new things. And, you know, this industry is like known as an industry of innovators and entrepreneurs. And I think we have a drive to take risks in a lot of ways, and we have a drive to try new things, but only in certain areas of what we're doing. Taking these more interpersonal and social risks in trying to create a space that is inclusive and creating a space that, really fosters belonging. Look, like Hassel said, looking around the room, who's not speaking up, who is speaking up. Constantly taking the mindset and the vantage point of like stalking who's not in the room, always asking yourself, who are we not hearing from? Why don't they feel like they belong here? Why aren't they coming to our space? You can benefit so much from so many different perspectives, but like we have to try new things and we have to take risks. And I'm finding in my work, the most innovative spaces and the most thriving spaces are coming from those people who are like, I need to try something new because what has been working isn't working, and what that really starts with from a zero cost here is you role modeling what you want to see. If we look at how we learn, Hassel and I were talking the other day about social learning. How we learn is, not just through a manual or an online course or whatever, but we learn by observing. How is someone behaving and how are they being rewarded or punished for that behavior within a social system? And then we end up behaving the ways that people who are rewarded behave. So if you're in a position of leadership and you're essentially rewarded with power over a space, how are you using that power? Is it abusive, or is it power too, or is it more nurturing? And people will pick up on those behaviors and adopt them, for better or worse. So trying new things also means maybe trying to be your favorite version of yourself in the workspace and giving that a go.
I love that, Laura.
I do too.
I love that as an ending because it brings it back to ourselves and what we can do, every day. So that's the end of our presentation. Thank you so much. We're sharing our emails here so that you can reach out, about anything. We both offer a variety of different trainings and, programs. And anyways, thank you so much for having us, Lori.
Thank you.
It's been my pleasure to sit and listen with you ladies. I think you made some amazing points. I'm going to ask if anyone does have questions. I do have a couple of questions here that I will table, and then if anyone else has questions, if they would like to enter them in the question room, that would be great. So the first one is, as a team leader, should I be actually asking how I can help a member of my team if I notice that they're struggling, or should I let them come to me?
That's a big question.
Huge and a great one.
And a great question. I would recommend approaching somebody and not asking specifics, because there's also like workplace like regulations and laws around like what questions we can ask. But approaching someone just being like, I just wanted to check in with you and see how you're feeling, how you're doing. You can maybe bring up some specific workplace behavior. Like it seems like you're taking a lot of breaks in the walk-in, and we want you to be able to take the time that you need, but I just want to make sure that you're doing okay. Another way to approach this would also be being vulnerable yourself and be like, I'm checking in with you because I've been feeling XYZ kind of way, and I see that you're taking a lot of breaks in the walk-in, and I'm wondering if maybe we're in the same boat here. That's a really great way to encourage, to build trust, first of all, but to encourage people to start, noticing what they need. And with that, you like also asserting your needs, like, yeah, I'm feeling this kind of way, and I think it's because I need this, and I'm like not getting it for myself. Will you be my accountability buddy? No, we are all human beings. Hassel, do you have anything to add to that?
I love everything you shared. I agree completely. I think it's very important if I've identified certain symptoms, that you understand how to respond accordingly. And like Laura said, there's lots of legalities that you need to be aware of. So I would definitely, educate yourself on that. But you actually do have a responsibility to address what you notice. And so as an owner operator, and so I would just add, yeah, vulnerability is contagious. So that's always a nice way to make it comfortable and safe, but have obviously boundaries around that. It's not about specifics. I think it's important also to acknowledge that, you know, in the same way as if someone hurt themselves physically, if I cut my hand open, you wouldn't ignore that in the workplace, right? You would have to address it and help connect me to the support I need. It's the same thing with anything workplace mental health related. You are not the help, but you can help connect them to the support that they need. So acknowledging that, learning more how to do that, becoming better equipped. Like I said, Laura and I, both Not 9 to 5 and Healthy Poor, offer trainings around a lot of this stuff. And so learning how to be better equipped around these conversations is integral. But great question, and thank you for asking it.
Excellent, excellent. And the other question is, I want to support my employees and encourage them to take time to manage their mental health, but how do I manage that when I'm, one, having such a hard time finding people? So this is in a restaurant atmosphere. And two, if someone needs to call in because they need a mental health day, which I support, we're left really short on the floor and it affects everybody else's mental health. How do I manage that?
With transparency, like being very honest of like, we want you all to have what you need, and we understand that this is a hard time. And honestly, it might be a little bit of a slog for a minute. Like, it's going to be hard, but the potential of, if people aren't getting what they need or they can't take those mental health days when they really need them, is that they're going to quit. And then what? You know, so it's also a big part of it is reimagining this, the procedures and the systems that are happening in the workplace. I think I mentioned last month that we're at a point that like the workforce is what it is. There's nobody else that's going to come in. Like it is what it is. You know, it might mean partnering with local community organizations and becoming more community integrated, you know, creating relationships with hospitality schools and colleges and start recruitment programs from there. That, you know, it's a very long game though, you know, and noting that in the moment, like no one's going to come and save us, you know? So we have to really prioritize the well-being of the people in the space, and having conversations with your teams of like, we're obviously short-staffed. We also want you to be able to get the rest that you have, and really rethinking, can we be open this day? Should we be open this day? What is the cost? Or should we shorten our hours? You know, really identifying those pieces so you can retain the people you have working with you already and their well-being.
Good points. Good points. Yeah, it's definitely a struggle in the hospitality industry. I'm sure it is for everyone. I don't see other questions. So, and we've got about a minute left. So, ladies, I'm going to thank you again. This was a wonderful way to spend time this morning, and just to reflect a little bit more on the importance of where your staff are, where you are as a leader in the process, because it doesn't necessarily come naturally to some leaders to do this kind of work, but there are ways to learn how to do this. So some of the things that were mentioned, your team is your greatest asset, always been top of mind for me, and certainly with the people I've worked with. I would go one step further and say your team is the face of your business. So if you're not caring enough for them, then how would you expect them to care enough for your customers? So it's just vital. It's vital to the continued success of your business. Creating a culture of check-in, systems of feedback. I think those are all integral parts of running a successful business, and having a really engaged team and one who's got your back. Looking at feedback as an opportunity to dig a little deeper, not just taking the feedback, but what do you do with that feedback? And how can you make
important part?
It is. You know, it's one thing to ask that question, but and then it's like, okay, I've done my job, but that's not it. You have to be able to take that feedback. So acknowledging growth and effort, creating a culture of belonging, taking risks. We all have to take risks, and acknowledging as leaders that we don't have all the answers. We don't, but we have to be open enough and vulnerable enough to say, I don't
Yes.
know, but I want to help. So there's, I know on your websites, there's a plethora of support materials. And I would encourage everyone to visit both Healthy Poor and Not 9 to 5. It's been an honor for me to have you ladies for the second time around doing this webinar, and RTO9 appreciates you stepping in, and I'm sure that we'll be talking again in the future. I appreciate everyone taking the time to attend. Again, this is recorded. It will be on our website, I'm going to say within a week. We have one of our key team members on a well-deserved holiday, so she'll be back next week. But thank you again, ladies. Thank you everyone for attending. I hope everyone has a lovely rest of your day.
Such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye. Take care.
Bye.